If you keep telling everyone, human beings are bad just for existing, don't do this, we're heading for disaster, and people just disengage. But if you can evoke people's love for nature, and if you can say, look, we are facing all these immense crises, but we're at the end of a civilization and at the beginning of a new civilization. Just imagine, this is one of the most amazing times to be alive. We're constantly berating China and Russia and various other countries for a lack of democracy, whilst our own democracy has just gone down in flames. But we also have to turn the mirror on ourselves. Like, in some ways, we get the government we deserve. We've got to transition from just being voters that show up every 4 years and become engaged citizens.
Today's guest is Benjamin J. Butler. He is a futurist, philosopher, and writer. Benjamin advises the UN on creating desirable futures for 2030 through 2050. He also sits on the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, as well as advising the World Economic Forum on quantum technology. This is a fascinating chat, which gets to the heart of many of the issues with the world today. Ben, great to have you here. Thanks for making the trip. So, first question, which I think everyone will have, is what is a futurist?
I get asked that a lot. There's a growing number of us now, but a futurist is essentially someone who helps people think about the future, think about possible, probable, and preferable futures to make wiser decisions today. Some people would say H.G. Wells was the first futurist, the grandfather futurist. I think there's every tribe, every nation has always had people that try and look out to the future and give advice.
Part of the work you do with the United Nations is helping them. I think one of the particularly interesting aspects of your work with these NGOs is the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. I would love to just have you sort of spell out a little bit what you guys think about, what's coming. We've obviously had some chats about this subject. I think your particular take on this, from an investing angle around ESG, is something that everyone really needs to think about when thinking about contextualizing ESG.
Yeah. Well, the UNFCCC, as it's often referred to, it organizes the COP events, the COP negotiations. I'm part of a little renegade group within that, Resilience Frontiers, and we've been given the mandate to look at the future beyond the SDGs, so beyond 2030. To look out to 2050.
SDGs being Sustainable Development Goals. That's just, I'm terrible with acronyms myself, so just for people watching.
Sure, yeah, no, I get it. So yeah, it's like a group of almost sci-fi thinkers and writers, and we have experts from different fields, and we, nothing's off the table. And by looking at a longer term perspective, we engage the imagination, which, I really think that the core capability of a good futurist isn't just like looking at data, which is always looking backwards and drawing straight lines to the future. Yes, you engage with data, but you have to use the imagination, which is why, in a way, futurism was born out of a science fiction in a way, like H.G. Wells. But yeah, we haven't published. We've not been so public, but that's going to change, I think, in the next 12 months or so. But of course, it's one of many things I do. So I'm not a representative of them. In terms of previous conversations, I think I've said to you before, I think one of the biggest mistakes humanity has made, or the environmental movement and the UN, and many people at the UN privately share this opinion with me, is reducing everything down to one silly number, carbon in the atmosphere. I think it's caused so many issues. You have half of the United States doesn't believe we're in an ecological crisis because we've just focused on climate, whereas we are in an ecological crisis. You look at biodiversity collapse, so many species have seen 60-70% declines in their biomass. When compared to when I was born, the biomass of many types of insects, bees included, have fallen 60-70%. I mean, that's quite serious ecosystem collapse. You've got so much plastic in the ocean. They're forecasting there'll soon be more plastic in the ocean than fish. We're poisoning in our environment. And the list goes on. So if you write down all of these environmental catastrophes, and you speak to a Republican in the States, they probably agree with you on a lot of it.
Yeah.
And for some bizarre reason, we've just focused on carbon in the atmosphere, and we're trying to forecast climate, which is probably one of the most difficult things to forecast. So I think one of the really positive things that happened last year is there's two COPs. Everyone thinks there's only one COP. There's actually two. There's the climate change one, and then there's the biodiversity COP. And finally, they're starting to sing from the same hymn sheet. And then there's the psychological thing as well. If you keep telling everyone, human beings are bad just for existing, don't do this, we're heading for disaster, and people just disengage. But if you can evoke people's love for nature, and if you can, like I do, say, look, we are facing all these immense crises, but we're at the end of a civilization and at the beginning of a new civilization. Just imagine, this is one of the most amazing times to be alive. You'll be an entrepreneur, you can be an evangelist for X, Y, and Z. You can create the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting way to look at it. I think, we'll talk about this, but ESG generally as an investing framework has lost a lot of credibility over the last few years. And, we just did our summit yesterday, which you attended, and it was very interesting to see a room full of 120 investors vote that they think that the amount of focus on ESG is going to be on the decline, but actually it's almost of the opinion of investors that it should be faded entirely from portfolios. Which I think, to your point, if we're focused on the wrong things or just trying to make it so simple that the focus actually makes no sense to your average person saying, well, look, I'm seeing you flying around the world in a private jet telling me that I need to reduce carbon. Right. I think it all becomes very hypocritical and painful. So would love to sort of get your view on how that ESG perspective specifically is shifting in terms of these sorts of groups, in terms of investors. Obviously, you're at the forefront of, as you say, bringing together these two different type of COPs and thinking about, what is the change and where are we going with that? Because they must realize that the shift in perception has gone the wrong way for them, right? They're losing this narrative discussion.
Yeah. Obviously, the decline in ESG, the reputational damage has been stronger in the States than Europe. I guess I lost faith in it when I saw a hydrocarbon company listed higher than Tesla in the ESG scores. And it's like, listed, love Elon Musk or hate him, but he's all about the future of civilization. And he created Tesla in order to deal with the climate crisis. That's the entire intention of the company. And there was an oil company higher. Utter madness. I think lumping E, S, and G together was silly anyway. So I foresee a fade in, and maybe there'll be separate funds. You'll have more funds that are completely focused on the green energy, green transition, and maybe you'll have governance funds and whatnot. But yeah, I think there'll be a decline and then a resurgence.
And how, if you think about that from the perspective of the groups you work with, how is that also, are you starting to see that shift already? Are people, coming around to that and thinking about how do we reposition that narrative?
The groups I'm involved in are not really setting those standards.
Okay.
So I don't really have an inside track, but yeah, it just makes complete common sense to me. And it goes back to what I said about climate as well. It's a lot of Republican states that have pushed back against ESG in the States.
Yeah.
But many Republicans were quite ardent environmentalists, which is why we need to get the conversation off climate only. Yes, talk about climate, but let's talk about all the other stuff as well. But yeah, lumping them together, I just thought was madness. Yeah, the future will be sustainable investment. I totally believe it. Technologies, companies that are the sort of Patagonia type companies that have that strong internal ethos, where they're trying not to waste, and maybe they're engaging with the circular economy. And demographics, there's a demographic war coming as well. The younger people very clearly care about this stuff. Yeah, I think it's inevitable that it will happen, but just not ESG.
Yeah, I think that was the conclusion from the summit yesterday with the panel of allocators. But ultimately, and we talked about the fact that there's a certain element of a hypocriticalness to it all as well. And there's an element of trust, and I think a lot of the organizations that you work with have lost a lot of trust with the public. And, the concern obviously post the COVID era is that trust is really very damaged. And, organizations like the World Economic Forum that felt it was their duty to come forward and create solutions around this with no real government mandate has created a lot of concern. So again, how do you think about these organizations evolving to regenerate that trust base? Because otherwise they're ineffective organizations, essentially.
I think there's a lot of ineffective organizations at the moment. The world is changing at an accelerating pace. We are at one of the most epic moments of human history. I would argue, I could argue it's the most important moment for, say, 300 years compared to the Industrial Revolution. But my deepest opinion is it's the biggest moment for 10,000 years since the Agricultural Revolution. So you have all these forces of change and institutions, many of them built after World War II, are unfit for purpose to deal with that immense change. Then you've got all the hypocrisy, as you say, in so many different ways. Corruption. I was just rereading a book by Al Gore the other day, and he was talking about, it was only in the 19th century when the Supreme Court was completely against lobbying. It was considered an anathema that people would be paid money to go to DC and make law. And now it's normal.
Yeah.
Literally some corporate lawyers actually write law and then it's rubber stamped. And this happens all around the world. Many of our major institutions are just not fit for purpose, and also are corrupt. And that's the problem. You've had the forever wars. The US has spent, $7 trillion on that. They could have spent the money, like China, on building up the infrastructure, building new bridges, airports, and maybe investing even more into AI. So yeah, the trust is collapsing. I read, so I think it was over 10 years ago now. I remember just seeing a chart of all these major institutions and the public's trust in them. They're all going down. Everyone, everything from education, government, journalism. Of course, that's created since.
Yeah, of course.
And then I read a declassified CIA report, and it said, using the framework that we apply all around the world, like to Latin American countries, etc. On that framework, the United States, it has entered a sort of a pre-revolutionary stage. It has the hallmarks of a potential revolution. And of course, I started writing about a potential civil war in the States. People thought I was nuts. Now, if you look at Google search for the term American Civil War, it's gone through the roof, and there's a movie out. I'm not sure if it's American Civil War, but Civil War. We're in a civil war in the States. Maybe it's not quite as bad as the last one yet, but you've had that insurrection, you've had violence, and social media. They're battling it out each day.
Yeah.
The other reason for, I think, a lot of this maelstrom of collapsing trust is, if you think about it, after the Gutenberg press was invented in Europe in the 16th century, and until the printing press, it was mainly the aristocracy and monks that had access to books. And then the printing press proliferated ideas across Europe and competing ideas. And that's when the church was challenged, and then you saw fundamental change in society, and you saw a lot of wars. In a way, the internet has only born in about the year 2000, really. Only really proliferated to the billions with the smartphones, say 2010. It's quite young in a way. and you've got all these ideas proliferating. And of course, that's going to cause instability. The optics of something like Davos, where a whole bunch of leaders rock up to a ski resort every year and they're sipping their champagne, whilst life expectancy in the States for male Caucasians is falling, where the concentration of wealth is going up, where stock market's at record highs, but the average person is living in poverty and has a couple of $100, if that, in savings. It's just this massive divergence. And so, of course, people are angry and suspicious. And something like World Economic Forum, I've met incredible people there with very noble intentions. You know, I'm not involved in the management of WEF, but, you know, I meet incredible people trying to do incredible things. But of course, it is corporate backed, and corporate power has gone to extremes. The founding fathers would be aghast at the power of corporations today. And so it needs to swing back, and it will.
Yeah. When you think about that, and obviously these are all the reasons that the trust has been lost. And you've obviously, I guess part of your role is helping these organizations reimagine the future and how it should look to reinstitute that trust. Like, what are the steps you're recommending for these? Or maybe not the steps necessarily, because they're much harder, but like, what's the big picture target or the North Star for these organizations to gravitate towards for us to reinstitute that trust?
I think greater public engagement and engagement with civil society. I mean, some institutions will just disappear. You know, after every war, you know, whether it was all these global organizations often disappear in flames. You know, you had the Concert of Europe, you had the League of Nations formed after World War I, that collapsed. After World War II, United Nations was formed. So some institutions just won't make the change. You know, they're out there, Kodak moment. But otherwise, you've got to engage civil society.
There's always a lot of focus on government, you know, being there to serve the people. And I think the problem is that focus has shifted, and governments are now serving themselves to some degree, and the elites that support them. Like, my feeling is that you need to start holding people responsible. There is an ETF that tracks Nancy Pelosi's insider trade, or essentially insider trading, that outperforms every hedge fund manager on the planet. I mean, it's just nuts that it's there so barefaced. That there is institutionalized theft happening and corruption happening in the supposed world leader. The United States, not Nancy Pelosi. Is there any sort of conversation happening holding people responsible, just getting, throwing someone like Nancy Pelosi in prison for clearly what would be a criminal act if she was not Speaker of the House or former Speaker of the House?
Yeah. I totally agree. We can't solve a lot of these problems we're currently facing if we don't solve democracy. And re-find our democracies. You know, we're constantly berating China and Russia and various other countries for a lack of democracy, whilst our own democracy has just gone down in flames. So we should ban lobbying. We should actually raise the pay of politicians. And then ban them from investments. I mean, there's some really commonsensical things one can do. We look at Singapore. The Prime Minister of Singapore earns way more than most heads of state in the Western world. And there's not much corruption in Singapore. And, people say, oh, you can't throw a chewing gum on the floor in Singapore. But my God, their policymakers think long-term. They think multi-generational. They hire futurists. In fact, Lee Kuan Yew, famously, his father worked for Shell, and Shell was the first corporation to hire a futurist. And so Lee Kuan Yew was always looking long term, and the policymakers there think long term. And the way they deal with corruption is actually pay them a decent wage. I mean, it's kind of insane that the British Prime Minister earns like less than a CB trader at 25 years old. It's kind of insane given the responsibilities. So no wonder they're looking for their backhanders, and or they get on the speaking circuit as soon as they leave, which isn't as bad. But it's when policymakers leave and they join all these boards, or a defense minister, leaves the board and is suddenly on the board of a defense contractor. So we've got to solve democracy. I'd go another step further and I'd get rid of political parties. Jefferson, I think, famously said, the birth of political parties will be the end of democracy. Because I think it's silly that you have a group of people that all vote one way, whereas they should be engaging with the issue and they should be voting with their conscience. So I'd get rid of political parties as well. And then there's a whole bunch of technological things we can implement as well. People way smarter than me are coming up with different ways of doing online referenda. Switzerland does some pretty good referendum. You could do a lot of things online now.
Yeah. So you're proposing, let's say, take the UK or, for example, the US, Republican versus Democrat or Conservative versus Labour. You remove those parties and you put every policy decision up for a referendum. Is that what you would be suggesting?
Not every, but you could have more referenda, and you get public opinion on things constantly.
I agree with that, living in Switzerland, but I look at what happened with Brexit and the misinformation that happened around that, with people in the same party, obviously trying to fight for different outcomes and creating these ridiculous policy statements about, if we leave Brexit, we get, £350 million a week for the NHS. These were barefaced lies, and people were able to get away with it. So I think, the idea is a good one, but there needs to be a level of education and a responsible level of education around balancing the decision. Yeah. Which is what you see in Switzerland a lot more. And again, when you've got that level of corruption already instilled in these democracies, like how do you move towards that sort of more responsible way? What's the transition? Because I'm sure that a lot of your work is okay, that's the North Star. How do we get there?
Well, two things. One, it's interesting. A friend of mine, Jennifer Nadell, an ex BBC ITV anchor, she's trying to reform Parliament at the moment, and she's promoting a bill in the Welsh Parliament to make it illegal to lie. It sounds quite revolutionary. You'd have thought we'd have laws like that.
Sure.
We should be doing things like that.
Agreed.
If you get busted, these guys just don't care. They constantly tell you lies, and then they just brush it off, or they'll answer the questions they want to answer, and they're never held accountable. So
that's two different things. There's the media not holding people responsible or accountable if they support that party. You've got the left-wing media, the right-wing media, so they'll softball questions. But to your point, I think that's a valid one. Like, why isn't that an illegal thing to lie to the populace?
Yeah, I think legislation like that is coming. And Wales has actually been a bit of a leader on certain things. They're the first country in the world to introduce a futurist, essentially, a future generations commissioner. It basically is meant to be looking longer term rather than short term electoral cycles. But going back to your point, I could sit here all day complaining about politicians, but we also have to turn the mirror on ourselves. Like, in some ways, we get the government we deserve. We've got to transition from just being voters that show up every 4 years and become engaged citizens, and educate ourselves and hold politicians accountable. Brexit was horrific. At the time, I remember people saying, some people should be disqualified from voting. That was actually a legitimate opinion a couple of millennia ago. When I was a law student, I studied some American law, then I studied English law, and of course, horrified to find out we don't really have a constitution. It's kind of like we have a few different documents, and then the rest is sort of esoteric, unlike the States. But there was a famous book by Walter Bagehot, wrote a book called The English Constitution and tried to bring some things together. And I think Paget was going on and on about the bovine majority. And I don't think he thought that the general public should actually be able to vote on things because they were insufficiently educated. So we did have to educate ourselves about issues. Brexit was horrendous. But yeah, we should have challenged the media more. And I do think we're at the worst point of misinformation. It might get a little bit worse before it gets better with AI and deepfakes. But we're approaching that sort of its darkest before the dawn moment. And already, actually, the youth of today have given up on mainstream media and they're listening to our podcasts.
Yeah.
Because if you're a politician who's used to being able to get away with BS and sound bites all the time, kind of difficult to hide your true self on a 2.5-hour podcast with Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, or Richard Byworth. I don't think you're going to do the long ones.
No, keep it short. On that point, I think there's a good turning point. Obviously this podcast, we want to always focus on like how to think from a different angle about investing in portfolio allocation. When we sat down in London a few weeks ago, you talked about the coming financial crisis. And I think it would be really good for you just to lay out your thesis around this. And then we can talk about maybe some ways that you view sensible portfolio allocation with that in mind.
Yeah. When GFC1 happened, which was not unforecastable, despite mainstream media saying, no one could have forecast this unprecedented event. I mean, God, I've gone back through it in my mind so many times. I mean, Bear Stearns, early 2007, you had all these like little warnings, like in Japanese, there's the word Yoshin, which is like the little earthquake before the earthquake. And there was just countless ones. I think we're probably having a series of them now and probably have a few more. Maybe Silicon Valley Bank was a little Yoshin last year to just remind us that when rates move very quickly, suddenly we find out that people made horrendous decisions. So I think when GFC1 happened and we came out of it and we didn't solve any of the underlying issues with the economy, the economic system, the financial system, or our political system, I kind of knew there'd be another financial crisis, but there'd be, at the time I was talking about GFC2, and GFC2 would be the political ramifications of not solving GFC1. So that would be a social crisis, a collapse in social cohesion, maybe even revolution or coup d'etats, as unthinkable as that might be. If you as Winston Churchill said, that the more you look back, the more you can look forward. And if you look at history, we're ripe for these moments. So January the 6th, to me, it was obvious that something like that would happen. And in fact, it was smaller than I thought. Maybe what's about to happen will be a bit bigger. But yeah, looking at the financial world, obviously there's been truckloads of money thrown into financial market. You've had the fiscal tailwinds. You've had central banks going nuts. The pandemic, even though the fatality rate was actually quite low, we treated it as though it was World War III. And all these governments are bankrupt, essentially. They're zombies. So you've got this debt. That's ultimately going to be a force of inflation because there's no way the governments are going to balance the budgets. So they're trying to inflate their way out of it. But then you've got all these other massive mega trends that I look at. So you've got the demographic collapse, utter collapse. First time in 700 years, global population will start falling by mid-century. I don't think it's dawned on us yet. And some countries already, the population is falling. China's lost 2 or 3 million people in the last couple of years. So it's just made that turning point. By the end of the century, the US population might be bigger than China.
Wow.
By the year 2100, if they allow a lot of immigration.
Right.
China's population is forecast by the Chinese think tanks themselves to go down to 500 million. And that has massive ramifications. But going back to my general thought, So you've got all these inflationary forces. So demographics, debt, geopolitics, and deglobalization. So the tensions there will cause these spikes in costs. So, like when Ukraine happened, which again was quite forecastable. If you look back at what happened from 2014, where the US started intervening increasingly in Ukraine, it was kind of forecastable there would be some tension, maybe a war. The result of the Ukraine invasion, of course, was a spike in energy costs and a lot of other things. So as long as we have a geopolitical tension in the world, then the risks are that we have another inflation spike. Climate change is another. Sorry, I don't use the word climate change. The ecological crisis is another reason why costs. There's going to be a lot of costs. Even when you look at the green energy, if such a thing really exists, but they're saying that we need to be spending $5 or $6 trillion a year just on renewable energy. So,
but when you look at all this and you look at, as you said, these forever wars, these geopolitical tensions that will potentially lead to other forever wars, are these not just excuses to be printing more money to justify the printing of more money to reduce the debt burden that all of these governments have, that they're ultimately completely insolvent anyway?
Yeah, well, external war is always a good distraction from internal problems. It doesn't surprise me. There's a general feeling we're inching our way towards war. I mean, we're in war already, of course. They say that the Ukraine war has been run out of London and the US. So we're kind of already in war. But my general point was, I told my clients in 2019, the 2020s will be characterized by bouts of massive inflation. That said, the countervailing force, which means at times interest rate spikes, and then, when the tide goes out, as Buffett said it, we find out who's swimming naked.
Swimming naked, yes.
Yeah. There's going to be so many more Silicon Valley banks. So I look at those big trends rather than like the high frequency data. So a lot of market investors think we're in this like Goldilocks zone now, where rates aren't really going to go up too much more, and they're going to fall at some point. But you just look out a few years and you can see so many reasons why inflation could spike again. That said, we should be in deflation because of technology. And that's the natural state. You and I lived in an economy that had deflation. It was okay, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Japan.
Yeah. And all the foreign economists would come in and say, you've got a serious problem. You need to create inflation. Well, so social cohesion collapses more, trust collapses more with inflation. And, we could be facing some hyperinflationary events, but technology and China are massive sources of deflation. And then obviously the biggest technology is where some people would argue that this moment, the singularity, as some people call it, is the biggest technological advance since handwriting or fire. And the guys in Silicon Valley are always good at these hyperbolic phrases, but they might actually be true this time. I mean, like dispensing intelligence across, the AI revolution is pretty serious. And so it wouldn't surprise me, once we've gone through this transition, this new world disorder that we're going through now, and we find balance again at the other end. Hopefully it's not World War III, but once we find balance again, I think we'll revert to deflation. But there are existing forces for deflation. I mean, China, obviously, they're overproducing and trying to export their electric vehicles all around the world for a fraction of the price of a Tesla.
But I think a deflationary world, that future deflationary world, which I agree with you, we're going to get to, is probably quite a few years out. How do we, just to bring it back to that final question, the way that we want to frame the discussion today is, how do we think about portfolio allocation within this future, however long it takes to play out? How are we thinking about portfolio allocation at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, lots of people in the last few years have blindly bought ETFs, and not use active management is probably the right thing to do. In many cases, I think now is an important time to start engaging with good active managers. I would be avoiding government bonds, obviously, for my aforementioned views. I would have some gold. I've been positive on gold for a while. I've been positive on markets like Japan. That's partly because of the macro economy and what I've seen there, but it was also partly the geopolitical play that as the tension with China grew, their so-called aircraft carrier in the Pacific, Japan would become even more important and the Americans would support them. And now we're seeing a lot of investment into Japanese technology again, and they're maybe having another renaissance there. There are a few markets that I'm interested in. I was interested, someone mentioned Turkey yesterday at the conference. I was in Turkey last year. I was quite impressed. Actually heard the finance minister speak. But I think you've got to have exposure to cryptocurrency, which for me is Bitcoin. If it was really strange the other day, Yuval Harari, who normally I have a lot of respect for, quite enjoyed his books. Sapiens was great. I mean, Homo Deus, okay, he's a historian. He's trying to play the role of a futurist. So I didn't agree with all of his forecasts in Homo Deus. But the other day at a conference, he said, I don't believe in cryptocurrency and Bitcoin because Bitcoin is a currency of distrust. And the future has to be about currencies of trust. And I was flabbergasted. It's like he's got it the other way, back to front. People are losing trust in the dollar. That's why inflation expectations are getting really anchored, and why we might end up having these hyperinflationary moments. So, I think that Bitcoin, ultimately, our future civilization will have to use something like Bitcoin, and Bitcoin already exists. So you wouldn't go out and reinvent Bitcoin. And it's not going to be one of the other 20,000 currencies as we discussed yesterday.
I think it would be impossible to reinvent Bitcoin. I think it was a once in a humanity moment. But you talked about, I mean, we can talk about Bitcoin all day. I think that's another discussion that we can probably have another time. But you mentioned active managers, which is obviously something that we're always interested in. Like you're thinking about in terms of hedge funds, maybe long short, this type of strategy.
Yeah, I'm more than long short. I think good macro funds, probably good. And then obviously some of the funds you guys are doing, the uncorrelated funds. Love what you're doing. For the record, you've not paid me to say any of this, but I do actually really like the fund of fund that you've launched and very much needed. And obviously you've got this first mover advantage as well. And I always tell friends who ask me about crypto, if you don't know what you're doing, don't trade, just buy some Bitcoin and forget about it. But if they can outsource the due diligence to you, and there's so many arbitrage opportunities in space, I think what you're doing is great. But yeah, you've got to find out uncorrelated assets, and a lot of correlations have gone to one, haven't they, in recent times, which shows me we are in the mother of all bubbles. So that concerned me.
Indeed. Well, look, Ben, that was an amazing chat. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. Is there anywhere that viewers can find your work, if you could share?
Sure, yeah, benjaminjbutler.com. It's a very easy way to get hold of me, or LinkedIn, something like that.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.